Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Jacob Davis. Jacob is an educational specialist for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland. As an education specialist, Jacob's primary role at the museum is to take the stories of the past and make them relatable to modern visitors. Jacob has 7 years of experience working in public history and museums and has a specific focus in historical interpretation. Jacob is a graduate of Frostburg State University with a bachelor's degree in history of the Americas. In today's presentation, we will learn the truth behind the most common misconceptions about Civil War medicine and how the innovations of Civil War medicine paved the way for our modern emergency medical system. So without further ado, I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Jacob.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and talking to you all today. So like many eras in history, the Civil War is no different in terms of the number of myths that sort of sprang out of the conflict, especially when we're talking about medicine. So there are 3 main myths that I really want to break down today. So the first is going to be the use of anesthetics during surgery. We're also going to be debunking the myth of the butcher surgeon, sort of that idea of the butcher surgeon. And finally, we're going to discuss the quality of care that the wounded soldiers received as they went through the military healthcare system. And I also, just as a quick warning for everybody, we are going to be talking about Civil War medicine today. So with that, there may be some images that come up that might be not for everybody. So again, that's just a brief warning as we go into our program today. So again, talking about our 3 myths. And where is they sort of spring from? So with anesthetics, a lot of times people have this idea that as surgery is being performed, especially during the Civil War, they have this idea of people biting down, on a piece of wood to be able to make it through the pain. As far as what research has told us is that in most cases during the Civil War, 95% of operations were done under the use of anesthetics. So we're going to be talking a little bit more thoroughly about that. We also have the idea of the butcher surgeon. So a lot of times when people think of Civil War doctors, they think of someone wearing a blood-covered, blood-soaked clothing, and just hacking and slashing away at their patients. And again, that is definitely a myth that is perpetuated throughout the Civil War. And then finally is sort of, again, the idea that healthcare during the Civil War was somehow inadequate. Potentially, if we are sort of looking at it through a modern lens, looking back on the past, it might be easy to sort of make assumptions about healthcare during the Civil War. But if you put yourself in sort of the perspective of someone, at that time, they're at the height of modern medicine for themselves at that time. So again, we're going to be talking about that just a little bit later on. So first, we're going to go in depth with anesthesia. So on October 16th, 1846, ether was used for the first time in a public display at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. And this was a surgery to remove a tumor from a patient's neck. And again, this is 15 years prior to the Civil War. So with it being 15 years prior to the Civil War, that means that anesthetics are not new by the time of the Civil War. They've already been used in a couple different conflicts. They've been used in the war in Crimea that happens in the 1850s. They've also been used in the Mexican-American War. Anesthetics are being used during surgery. And I also want to say that this image that we have here, for anyone that was here when we were talking about that ambulance image back at the beginning of the program, and I said that it was a staged image, well, that was a pretty common thing during this period of early photography. And so this image that you guys are seeing right here is also a staged image. There is a painting, a pretty famous painting of the surgery as it's happening. But in most cases, if something important happened, and you can think that even up to, raising the flag at Iwo Jima, for instance, where that's a sort of a staged image, it's kind of the same idea here in this image. So basically, they all get back together, and essentially they stage the first use of anesthetics, again, for future generations. So again, this is a staged image of that first surgery using anesthetics. So like I said, during the Civil War, 95% of operations were done using anesthetics. And it's important to note that some 100,000 total operations were performed during the war, and that 60,000 of those 100,000 operations were amputations. So again, 60,000 amputations carried out during the American Civil War, and that is on both sides of the conflict. So the two most common anesthetics that are going to be used during this period are going to be chloroform and ether. So ether sort of first arrives on the scene, and it's going to be one of the first anesthetics that is used during this time period. Chloroform, though, ends up becoming more popular. And that ends up happening for several reasons why chloroform ends up becoming more popular. Most importantly, it takes less chloroform to bring on the effects of anesthesia. And it also, ether is incredibly flammable, almost explosively so. So you can imagine that if you are on a Civil War battlefield and you're doing surgery late into the night under candlelight, that using a chemical that could potentially be flammable might not be the best idea. So chloroform is going to be the most popular anesthetic, again, because it takes less to bring about general anesthesia, and it's also not flammable. And then alcohol is not used as an anesthetic. Again, a myth that is widely perpetuated from, whether it's this time period or even prior, if we go back to like the American Revolution, for instance, alcohol is never really used as an anesthetic. Alcohol will be used, and specifically whiskey is what's going to be used during the American Civil War. Whiskey will be used as a stimulant to basically keep a patient from going into shock, but it's not going to be used as an anesthetic. It's not going to be used, you're not going to get a patient incredibly drunk on whiskey and then start performing surgery on them. That was not the case. But there's a reason why that myth may have been perpetuated. So soldiers that might be waiting for surgery will be sitting obviously off to the sidelines waiting for surgery. And then you also have journalists that are covering the conflict as well. And they're observing patients being given whiskey. And then in that as well, they might also be observing patients being given ether or chloroform as an anesthetic. And so you can imagine that if you're sitting on the sidelines and you're watching that happen, you might start to believe that, they're giving patients just whiskey before they start operating on them, before they, start cutting into those patients. So a lot of times those myths are perpetuated through outside observers that might not completely understand what's going on. Whenever ether or chloroform or any anesthetic at this time is given to a patient, typically the way that that's going to be administered is through a cone that will sit over the patient's face. And it'll have a sponge inside of the cone, at which point the liquid chloroform or liquid ether will then be dropped into that cone, into that sponge, so that way it can be inhaled by the patient to put the patient under. The amount of chloroform and ether that they're using at this time is just enough to basically put the patient under. But today, if a patient was being put under the use of general anesthetics, they're going to be put into a state, as well as being given other drugs that will keep the patient still throughout surgery. But at this time, because they don't necessarily have an abundance of chloroform and ether, there are lots of surgeries that are happening at this time, and they want to conserve as much as possible. What ends up happening is that whenever patients are put under, they're really only put under into almost a second stage of anesthesia. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So there are 4 stages of general anesthesia whenever you're putting a patient under. And those 4 stages are induction, excitement, surgical, and overdose. So a little bit about each of those. So induction, during the induction stage, the patient progresses from analgesia, a state of feeling no pain without amnesia, to analgesia with amnesia. And that's important because there's a couple things that anesthetics do, and it's why they are so revolutionary. And that is that, one, they give you analgesia, which is feeling no pain. They give you amnesia, so you don't remember the surgery. And of course, it puts you to sleep as well. So you don't have to even experience any part of the surgery. And so, of course, with those three things in mind, no pain, amnesia, and to sleep, you can imagine that, for all of human history, when we've been performing surgeries and those patients have been awake, that the fact that now a patient can be put under and not have any adverse effects necessarily during that surgery, or at least feel the adverse effects of a surgery, that is a pretty huge innovation. So again, you have the first stage of anesthesia, which is induction. And then second, during this time period, patients can carry on a conversation. So even though a patient is going under, they can still talk. They can still sort of have a little bit of an idea of what's going on around them. So they're not completely put under yet. So excitement is the second period. And typically during the Civil War, excitement would be the stage of anesthesia where a lot of patients are going to be under. So in this period, following the loss of consciousness, it's marked by excited and delirious activity, uncontrolled movements, vomiting, suspension of breathing, pupillary dilation. And today, surgeons are able to quickly move through this stage, so that way you don't have a patient writhing around, moving around on the table. The best that I can describe it is just how today, or just how when we all sleep, some of us might talk in our sleep, some of us might thrash in our sleep, some of us might just move in our sleep. It's very similar to that, this period of excitement. And so you can then imagine, again, putting yourself in the perspective of an observer of a surgery. If you see a patient on the table, lying down on the table, their legs are moving, their arms are moving, they might be moaning, it might give a journalist or an outside observer the idea that, oh my goodness, they're performing surgery on this person while they're completely wide awake. What monsters? And then myths like that will then be published. For instance, there were articles published in the New York Times at the time, basically saying, oh, they're performing these surgeries without any use of anesthetics. The patients are completely awake. But again, really what they're probably witnessing is a patient in that period of excitement. And then finally, and then you get into surgical, which of course, during surgical anesthesia, that's when the patient is completely under, completely relaxed. But oftentimes during Civil War surgery, they won't always get to that period. You have, like you can see in the image here on this slide, a team of people, and in the Civil War, there would have been 3 surgeons working at the table, plus assistants and nurses. And all those people would work together to hold the patient steady, especially if they're in that excitement period. And so again, it might look like all these patients, they have to hold down these poor people while they're performing surgeries on them. But again, the patients are completely anesthetized. It's just that they're in that period of excitement where they're still moving around. And then finally, the final stage is overdose. It is very difficult at this time with chloroform and ether, and in the amount that they're administering, it is very difficult to overdose on these anesthetics. At that time, there are, I think, 1 or 2 examples of an overdose on anesthetics. One of the examples is a child. So obviously, children having lower dose tolerance, that really describes that instance of why a child would have overdosed. Basically, they were just given too much. But anesthetics are very, very difficult to overdose on. So it's they're safe. They put you under, and they are an incredible, especially at this time of the American Civil War, still a modern marvel in the world of care and surgery. So I want to talk about a few examples while we're still talking about anesthesia of the sort of the effects of anesthesia. So I have a few quotes here from both medical experts and people that are having, that were under the use of general anesthetic. So my first quote is from Robert F. Riley. He's a medical doctor. He wrote, "In the medical and surgical care during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865 was the name of his book. So chloroform was preferred because it was quicker onset of action, could be used in small volumes, and was non-flammable. Anesthesia was fairly light, stage 2, so again, that excitement stage, leading to the misperception that it was not being used." So that's someone talking about the medicine of the time period and again, dispelling that myth, saying that, it leads to a misperception that it's not being used. So here's another quote. This one's a pretty famous one. It's giving chloroform to Stonewall Jackson whenever he's going under to have his surgeries. And this is one of Stonewall Jackson's surgeons, Hunter McGuire, medical doctor. So at 2 o'clock Sunday morning, surgeons Black, Walls, and Coleman being present, I informed him, Jackson, that chloroform would be given him and his wounds examined. I told him that amputation would probably be required, and asked if it was found necessary, whether it should be done at once. He replied promptly, "Yes, certainly, Dr. McGuire. Do for me whatever you think best." Chloroform was then administered, and as he began to feel the effects and its relief to the pain he was suffering, he exclaimed, "What an infinite blessing," and continued to repeat the word blessing until he became insensible. And I want to talk really quickly. The stages of anesthesia is not something that was understood at the time of the American Civil War. Categorizing them in those stages is something that comes about later. Basically, at this point, whenever you would talk about someone being under the use of anesthetics, and you read this time and time again throughout medical journals from the time period, is that they refer to patients becoming insensible is the main word that is used to describe patients being put under. And then the next quote is specifically about a patient being made insensible. And this was observed by R.M. Peck, is the gentleman's name. And this was after the Battle of Pea Ridge in 1862, March 8th, 1862. So after his leg was taken off, the stump done up, and chloroform taken away, he soon opened his eyes and remarked to one of the surgeons, "See here, doc, if you're going to take that leg off, you'd better be about it. I'm coming too." When told the leg was already off and the stump done up in a rag, he raised himself a little on his elbows to look and see if such was really the case, remarking, "Is that so? I didn't know a thing about it." So here's this patient. He is completely insensible to the fact that he has already had his leg amputated. And he's in disbelief when he is told that his leg has already been amputated. So again, sort of showing the benefits of anesthetics at this time and their ability to make patients insensible. There's another, it's sort of a funny anecdote, well, I guess a little bit of gallows humor, because we are talking about amputation, where one patient has basically a very bad wound to his hand. And he's being given chloroform, and he gets into that stage of excitement, and he starts thrashing around on the table. And all of a sudden he starts coming to, and this is even before he's had his surgery or his, or his hand has really been operated on. But again, his hand is mangled, and he starts coming to, and he starts realizing everyone is laughing. And there's a nurse that's lying down on the ground. She's picking herself up off the ground. She's covered in blood. And he realizes that in his stage of excitement, whenever he's being put under general anesthetics and he's thrashing around, that he actually hit the nurse in the face, and he's kicking his legs around as well. And again, it's basically a story that ends up being shared quite widely during that time period. And again, just the fact that everyone, I guess, is able to take a moment to sort of laugh at the situation, but again, demonstrates that period of excitement. And again, why an outside observer might look at someone who's being put under the use of general anesthetics and think that those people are wide awake. And then that thrashing, that fighting is them basically trying to fight back against the surgeons that are performing the surgery on them because they're in some kind of pain or something like that. But again, it couldn't be further from the truth. Again, 95% of operations during the Civil War were done under the use of general anesthetics, and the patients were completely insensible to what was being done to them. And really quickly here, if I can go back. Oh, can't go back. That's fine. So in the previous image, I know that some of you have this slideshow available too, but you can see a patient being put under the use of an ether cone. But again, that's another staged image to demonstrate that. So now we're going to talk about one of the next myths during this time period, and that is the idea of the butcher surgeon. So you see this cartoon off to the side. This is a cartoon that that was published at the time, and again perpetuating the myth of sort of again surgeons as a butcher, as you know, maybe they have little to no medical experience, medical knowledge, and so therefore they just come in. You see that last line, to mangle, saw, and hack us. But again, this is a myth that is perpetuated throughout this period. So surgeons during the Civil War often have a bad reputation of being butchers and treating their patients like a cut of meat to quickly hack apart. This couldn't be further from the truth. Doctors were trained in the latest medical knowledge of their time. So again, it's important to keep in mind, trained in the latest medical knowledge of their time. So what is the medical knowledge of their time? So at the onset of the war, surgeons were only required to go to medical school for 2 years. And this did not include a practicum period. So if surgeon wanted hand-on experience, they had to secure an apprenticeship with an experienced doctor. So again, today, medical school obviously lasts 6 to 8 years. There are, there's lots of practice working on individuals and doing surgery on individuals, working with actual patients. But during the Civil War, medical school was not quite like that. So there were 40 medical schools in the United States before the war. Medical school at the time, as mentioned before, was a 2-year program. Typically, the second year of study was a repeat of the first year with the same lectures, the same exams, believing that repetition was a way to educate. So you're paying for medical school and you're going to sit through the same lecture in the fall semester of 1855, and then you might sit through that same exact lecture in the fall semester of 1856, the following year. And again, basically, it is just a lecture. You're being lectured on, medical maladies. You're being lectured on maybe how surgery is performed, but you're not actually having any hands-on experience to practice surgery yourself. So there were also no licensing requirements at this time to practice medicine, but over 80% of physicians held degrees from formal medical schools. That other 20% are people that may just be claiming, I'm a doctor, I've invented a miracle cure, or they might make their way out into some country area where there is no doctor. They see that there is an opening to potentially start charging people money to provide some kind of care, and we'll just start doing that. But again, that's only 20% of doctors at this time are sort of not true doctors, not actually practicing real medicine. 80% though would have gone through a medical school and actually had a medical degree from an accredited medical school at this time. It's also important to note that during the Civil War, medical knowledge and expertise was equal on both sides of the conflict. So Civil War surgeons were subject to physical and professional oral examinations by a board of surgeons prior to being allowed to practice medicine for the military. So these boards would not allow just anybody to become a military surgeon. So you can see in this image on this slide, This is actually a sketch from the time period, and this is a sketch of a naval surgeons during doing a board examination. So you can see that there are 3 surgeons sitting at the table. We have one gentleman then there on the left, who is the one who's being basically examined. And there is, like I said, there is some physical part to it, but that might be, like you can see in the background there, if you look closely, you can see that there is sort of a medical skeleton hanging. So that physical part may just be pointing out different bones in the human body, pointing out where different things are located in the human body. But for the most part, it's just these 3 guys on this board, these 3 surgeons on the board, essentially just asking questions of you and giving you an oral examination. But still, it's important to keep in mind that they did have to go through an oral examination, which would weed out potential doctors that maybe were lacking thorough information and lacking thorough knowledge of medicine at this time. So with that in mind, talking about surgeons of this time period, the idea of the butcher, where does the idea of the butcher surgeon come from? And it probably comes from the most practiced procedure during the war, which was amputation. So prior to the war, civilian amputations had a mortality rate of 50%. So if you were someone who was maimed in, let's say, an agricultural accident, and you go in for surgery, it is a 50% chance that you will die as a result of your surgery, whether that's because of just bad practices during that surgery or the type of recovery after the surgery. Again, 50% mortality rate civilian mortality rate prior to the American Civil War. So that number during the war falls to 26% among soldiers who had limbs amputated during surgery. So again, falling from 50% to 26%, that tells you that obviously these surgeons are doing something right. Basically at this point, people are now able to really sort of ply their craft. They have obviously a wide variety of people to be plying that craft on. And they're able to advance medicine during the Civil War as opposed to entrenching themselves in old practices. So the amputations that are being done at this time, amputations could be finished in as little as 15 minutes from start to finish. And surgeons wanted to work fast. So the faster an operation was performed, the more a patient had at a chance of survival. So obviously at this time, where they're working with a limited number of anesthetics to keep patients under during surgery. And the other thing too is that today we have IVs, we have heart rate monitors, we have all sorts of an apparatus set up to monitor a patient during surgery. And of course, during that time, they didn't have that available to them. They couldn't give patients necessarily fluids during a surgery. They couldn't have them on an IV drip. They couldn't give them a blood transfusion if they really needed it. And so that's why surgeries were done so quickly. Again, being able to amputate perform a capital amputation, so amputating one of the main extremities in as little as 15 minutes. But believe it or not, that's actually up from prior military conflicts at this time, or prior to the Civil War. So for instance, during the American Revolution, during the 18th century, surgeons could get a surgery done in as little as 3 to 5 minutes. So they've now increased that time up to 15 minutes. And one of the reasons that the surgeries were done so quickly prior to the use of anesthetics is obviously your patient is awake through all of it. So you needed to work quickly. So that 3 to 5 minutes was basically for the humanity of the patient. But now with anesthetics, patients are able to, or surgeons are able to take a whopping 15 minutes to be able to perform a surgery on an injured individual. So at least 60,000 capital amputations were recorded during the war by both sides total. So that is a lot of cutting and sawing and a lot of blood-covered clothing. So it's no wonder how surgeons receive their nickname as butchers, especially, again, if you are an outside observer observing these surgeons working their craft. So why were amputations so common during the Civil War? Today, we have so much of the ability to potentially do reconstructive surgery to save limbs. But during the Civil War, the destructive nature of the Menet ball, which is the bullet that is being used, which if you are following along with the slides here, that is the image that is down in the top left, or I'm sorry, the bottom left corner here, is a Menet ball that has been fired. So the destructive nature of the Menet ball, which was the main type of ammunition used during the Civil War, used by Civil War rifles. So it's made of a soft lead and it travels much slower than a modern bullet does today. The Menet ball then would mushroom whenever it was fired and whenever it would strike a target. And that meant that soft tissue would be destroyed and bone would be shattered. So you can see in the image, you can see sort of that mushroomed Menet ball. So whenever that hits its intended target, hits a person, a soldier, it doesn't cleanly pierce through a wound like a modern bullet might do today. It'll carry a lot of tissue with it, and it will also cause a really bad shattering of the bone. So the image that's in the top right-hand corner of a shattered bone, that is a bone that was struck by a Menet ball. And you can see the destructive nature of the Menet ball and what it would likely do, obviously, to a patient. Just imagine that inside the arm of a patient. And because, again, surgeons don't have necessarily the time or even the expertise to reconstruct bone, the best chance of patient survival was through amputation. So again, it's not because these are butchers, it's because that they're working with what they have available to them and their ability to try and save as many lives as possible. So amputations then would only be carried out after the patient had been assessed by several surgeons, so usually 3 surgeons. And the surgeons would then need to agree. So all 3 surgeons would need to agree that the patient actually needed that life-saving surgery. So again, it's not like, okay, get this guy up on the table, cut his limbs off, move on to the next guy. Get this guy up on the table, cut his limbs off. So again, this is well thought out. They understand that they are about to remove the limb of a human being, and so they're not just butchers. They're not just trying to cut off as many limbs as possible to meet some sort of quota or something like that. They are being thoughtful about it. And again, they're limited to their ability at the time. So I'm going to let this contemporary source, this is from the Confederate States Medical and Surgical Journal, to basically sum up amputations during the Civil War and the idea of the butcher surgeon. So this is, again, this is from the Confederate States Medical and Surgical Journal. The theory of this almost universal law of surgical practice is this: that it is better for the Constitution to bear 1 shock than 2, and no reflecting man will deny it. It therefore resolves itself into the necessity of an immediate decision, now or never. Now saves life, but at the expense of a limb. Never risks life. And it is our first duty to preserve it. But this well-sounding theory, although it proclaims truth in abstract, does not proclaim truth in application. It is true to the letter, not to the spirit. The exceptions of its applications are infinite, strictly speaking. It only applies in full force to cases of extreme injury, such as large contusions, crushings, and lacerations of the limb, recovery from which is beyond hope or appeal. Consequent on such destruction, the Constitution must necessarily sink. And the earlier the amputation, the more probably the recovery, because collapse of the vital powers is the certain issue, and reaction is impossible. So basically, After the vital powers start to collapse, being able to revive that patient and being able to save that patient become impossible, excuse me. So amputations are a common solution in how to care for a patient. So again, these are people that are working with inside of the knowledge that they have, working with the tools that they have at their disposal. And again, the people that would call them butcher surgeons and perpetuate that myth are people that have little to no medical knowledge at that time. So again, that's one of those myths that is very, very widely perpetuated still to this day, is the idea of the sawbones, the butcher surgeon. So now from surgery, we're going to follow a little bit of a narrative, but it helps us talk about the next myth that we're going to be talking about, which is the quality of care that patients are going to be receiving at this time. So our final myth is the quality of care for the sick and wounded, or that the quality of care for the sick and wounded was poor and led to more death than preventing it. Before we get into the weeds with this myth, it should be noted that germ theory had not yet been discovered. Lack of understanding of germ theory, disease, and its spread led to massive outbreaks of infectious disease. So out of 750,000 known deaths among soldiers on both sides during the conflict, and this is something that we really like to stress here, not like to stress, but really stress here at the museum when we're talking, and why we feel that a Civil War medicine museum is so important. So again, out of 750,000 deaths during the American Civil War, just with soldiers, that's not counting civilian population, 2/3 of that 750,000 were caused by disease, with diarrhea and dysentery being the #1 killers during the American Civil War. So not fighting on the battlefield, not being struck by a bullet, but disease is what is killing the most soldiers during this time period. So how is disease able to spread in these camps? Well, this is obviously a time where, again, people don't understand germ theory, and disease is able to spread that way as well. And it's also important to note that when we're talking about amputation, that because there's no understanding of germ theory, because there's no understanding of sanitation, that oftentimes the tools that surgeons are using, while they might be beautiful steel blades that are hyper sharp, the handles of those blades are oftentimes made from wood or ivory, which are not sanitary, which can hold disease inside the pores of the wood and inside the ivory. And whenever surgeons go to clean their tools, they will oftentimes just take, sometimes bloody water, or maybe the water is newly cleaned, but they haven't sanitized, they haven't used bleach, they haven't used anything along those lines, and they'll take just a simple water and a sponge, clean off their tools, and then go to work on the next patient. So that's one way where people obviously don't understand germ theory in a way that would help their patients. The other way that a lack of understanding of germ theory spreads disease is obviously if you have soldiers who might be living on a rural farm for the first time, being brought in and mingling with soldiers that were recruited from the docks of Manhattan. Obviously, that spread of disease from someone who grew up with childhood diseases, grew up around a lot of people, built up an immunity, now meeting up with people from, say, upstate rural New York, meeting for the first time, that disease is able to spread rampant through those people that don't necessarily have that built up immune system. And the way that dysentery and diarrhea is being spread at this time is, again, because of a lack of understanding of germ theory, and mostly from people drinking dirty water. So, when you have a lot of people, a lot of soldiers, sometimes a camp would consist of thousands of soldiers. They're all using the same waterways, using those waterways to both get drinking water, to make their coffee, to make soups and stews. And they're using that water as almost sometimes an open sewer. you can very quickly start to see how a misunderstanding of germ theory leads to disease. So again, I'm sort of dispelling some of the things that we might look at today and say, okay, well, obviously those are some shortcomings in terms of the quality of care. But this is just to set us up to then talk about where the quality of care was good. So let's say you do get sick. What types of things would you be prescribed? Well, this is where there's still some questionable practices that are being done during the American Civil War. And medicine was a mixed bag that ranged from good to bad. So there were effective treatments like quinine for treating malaria. And it should be noted that this is still an effective treatment for malaria to this day, both as an anti-malarial, so prior to getting malaria, and as a treatment for malaria. So quinine would be prescribed pretty widely. And again, because there's not really an understanding of germ theory, it should be noted too that they didn't understand where malaria was coming from. And literally in Latin, malaria translates to bad air. And that is because people believe that bad air, bad smells, or miasmas were what were making people sick, and not that there were mosquitoes carrying, bloodborne diseases. So quinine is a good example of a drug that would be administered to patients. On the other end of the spectrum, however, patients could be liberally prescribed mercury as a purgative and a laxative, which this was also a holdover from older medical practices dating, in some cases, 2,000 years dating to 2,000 years in the past, where purging or making yourself vomit or making yourself use the bathroom a lot was a way to balance the systems in your body. So again, this is an older idea of medicine and a holdover from going all the way back to the ancient Greek practices of medicine. And then some of the other drugs that were given as well was an overprescription of opium. So opium-based medicine was also readily available. 10 million doses were given to the Union Army alone and resulted in a nationwide opium addiction crisis following the war. Again, there are some shortcomings to care at the time of the American Civil War, but this is also a time where medicine is advancing. And it's in large part thanks to this gentleman here, Jonathan Letterman. So while some care practices were questionable, most practices saved lives and revolutionized medical care with ripples that we still feel to this day. Jonathan Letterman, a name that many have probably never heard of before, is credited as the father of modern emergency medicine and battlefield medicine. Many of the innovations he introduced during the war are still fundamental to today's civilian emergency medical service and modern combat medicine. Letterman was appointed the medical director of the Army of the Potomac in 1862, and he was what he represented was a new and more modern approach to medicine. Dr. Letterman created America's first professional ambulance corps. Prior to Letterman, ambulances were under the charge of the Army Quartermaster Department, and as such were more readily used for moving supplies and munitions and not the wounded, which seems, pretty counterintuitive. So what this meant is that following the battle, wounded sometimes languished on the battlefield for days before receiving potentially life-saving treatment. So Letterman's greatest contribution was the creation of a system of evacuation and care for combat casualties. We call this system today the Letterman system. It also established an early form of triage to assess the wounded based on their injuries. So ranging from slightly wounded, mildly wounded, severely wounded, to mortally wounded. So the Letterman system established a three-tiered system of care, starting with the field dressing station, where medical personnel would administer aid, stop bleeding, which Stop the Bleeding campaign is still a big thing today. And that was something that Jonathan Letterman realized all the way back in the 1860s, that if we can stop the bleeding on the battlefield at a field dressing station, that the patient has a much higher likelihood of survivability. So they would dress wounds and they would use an early form of triage to assess the wounded. So as I said, that form of triage was assessing the wounded from slightly wounded, where you might just have a simple scrape or a cut or a graze from a bullet, to mildly wounded, you might have a severe cut that requires some sort of bandaging. Severely wounded, usually that's you've taken a shot to an arm or a leg and you're going to need probably an amputation. And then mortally wounded, and oftentimes mortally wounded included head wounds, because again, you're not going to be doing invasive surgery and brain surgery, and oftentimes wounds to the trunk of the body. So if you've been shot in the liver, for instance, that would oftentimes be mortally wounded. And the reason that they're doing this system of triage is to assess where the care was needed. And if you're someone who's mortally wounded, well, unfortunately, they might just try to make you comfortable because they want to spend more time and more attention trying to care for the people that they have a likelihood of saving and giving them, a fulfilling life there afterwards. So after they would move from a field dressing station, from there, they would move to a field hospital. They would be transported by ambulance, just like in the image that you see here in the bottom right-hand corner, transplanted by ambulance to a field hospital. And at the field hospital, that's where surgeons could provide life-saving surgery, literally right there on the battlefield. They could stabilize the patient, perform those surgeries, bandage the patient. And then once the patient was stable and able to be transported, at that point, they would move to the final tier of recovery, the third and final tier of recovery, which was a general hospital. And it should really be noted that prior to the Civil War, there were no community hospitals as we know them today. So when people became ill, their family doctor would come visit them in their home. And hospitals, like we understand them, only really existed for the poor. And that's where the poor would essentially go to die because they couldn't necessarily afford to have a family doctor come visit them in their home. There were also military hospitals, but the largest military hospital at the outbreak of the American Civil War was in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and it only had 40 beds. So obviously, there is a big understanding that, there needs to be a change and that change needs to happen. Once patients, so basically by the end of the war, Confederate and federal governments had built nearly 200 hospitals and adapted many more existing buildings into hospitals with hundreds and thousands of beds each. A really good example of this is here in Frederick, Maryland. After the Battle of Antietam in 1863, Frederick, Maryland becomes one vast hospital where the population of Frederick actually doubles in size. So it's a population of 8,000. 8,000 patients from the battle are then brought here for recovery after receiving wounds. And this is a new thing, having these massive hospitals to care for the wounded. So not only, were the hospitals, places for recovery, over the course of the Civil War, they start to sort of realize that the hospitals need to be sanitary. And again, they don't understand necessarily germ theory, but what they do understand is that when you change patients' bandages regularly, and when you change their bedding regularly, when you give them a healthy diet, when you give them fresh air and you open the windows in their wards. And not only that, when you separate patients into wards, which is a relatively new idea of thinking at the time of the Civil War, having patients with infectious diseases, even though of course they don't quite understand, they know that how disease kind of spreads. They know that if you put patients side by side, that disease might spread. So again, you're going to have a ward where patients with diseases are going to be housed, and then wards where people are recovering from surgery will be housed. And again, this is a sort of a new concept and a new idea that is being that is sort of blossoming during this time. And because of that, because of the innovations that are happening during this time period, and because of the plan that Jonathan Letterman is able to establish, Jonathan Letterman's plan would go on to be celebrated then. During World War II, the medical director for the European theater basically says he thanks God every single day for Jonathan Letterman. He basically says that had I been put in a similar situation where I had to basically develop an entire system of evacuation and care for the wounded, he says that he doesn't think that he'd be able to do the same thing. So again, he thanks God every single day for Jonathan Letterman. So it's a plan that would be remembered, and a plan, like I said, that's still the basis of our modern medical emergency system and evacuation system to this day. So in a general hospital, like I said, cleanliness is starting to be found out to be related to good health. You start having basically, because now too, you have a wide variety of patients to basically try new medical practices on, that you have things like bromine being used to treat gangrene. It kills gangrene, and that increases the survivability rate. You can also see in these two images, these are two really good examples of the type of care and cleanliness that came to be expected during this conflict. You also have civilian efforts that are happening during this time as well, like the United States Sanitary Commission, which is a completely civilian-run organization, is coming in. They're evaluating the sanitary conditions of hospitals, and they are basically suggesting changes that can be made to make the hospitals a much more sanitary place for basically the recovery of patients. So it should be noted as well that if you made it to a general hospital, so you've made it through the field dressing station, you've made it through the field hospital and surgery, and now you're in a hospital where you have the ability to recover, that the survivability rate for people in a general hospital hits 92%. It becomes a 92% survivability rate, which again, when you think that prior to the Civil War, that 50% of people that were suffered from were given amputation as a form of treatment, that 50%, there was a 50% mortality rate, and now during the Civil War, you get up to a 92% survival rate. That is staggering. And again, that goes to show you the level of care, the level of cleanliness, and the adaptations that start to be made during the war. So again, this is not, these are not backwoods hospitals where, they're being given, medicines that are only harming them as opposed to helping them. That you see massive change during this time period and throughout the American Civil War. And again, it is the basis, it is the foundation for our modern medical system to this day. In conclusion, if you hear basically an ambulance flying down the road, when you unfortunately see a mass casualty incident in the news, and you see triage being taken, happening right there, and patients being assessed right on the battlefield, all of those systems date back to Jonathan Letterman and date back to the Civil War. We are still practicing the same types of systems of evacuation that were first developed during the American Civil War. And the reason that we're doing that is because they work, because they are successful in their ability to save people. So again, the idea that the quality of care was somehow inadequate during the Civil War, while it is, again, in terms of germ theory, you can make arguments, but in terms of just the recovery and the care of the patients, that's where the quality of care really steps up. So I also want to say that if you have any if you want to learn any further information, you can always visit our website. If you don't have the ability to come, obviously, all the way out here, I know a lot of you are based out of Nevada. If you don't have the ability to come all the way out to Frederick, Maryland, you can always visit our website at civilwarmed.org. It's a wonderful website. It has a lot of really important information. We also regularly post blogs to our website. We're regularly posting news about the goings on here at the museum. And it's a really good place to figure out about different virtual programs that we'll be doing as well, which we do try to regularly do. We have at least one virtual program a month where we sit down with authors and other professionals in basically the world of Civil War medicine to talk Civil War medicine. We also have 3 sites that we basically care for. We have the museum here in Frederick, where I'm coming to you from now. You can see it in the picture, the top image there of the house. That is the Pry House Field Hospital, which was a very important field hospital during the Battle of Antietam. And we have a museum there as well at Antietam National Battlefield. And then we also have Clara Barton's Missing Soldiers Office, which is in downtown Washington, D.C. And at the Missing Soldiers Office, basically that is where Clara Barton continues the work of the American Civil War after the Civil War. It didn't just end in 1865. It's through the works of Clara Barton that she is able to help identify soldiers that go missing, whether they died in combat, whether they went missing in action. And Clara Barton was able to then, through her work, was able to identify and find thousands of soldiers to give closure to families and to friends that were hurting after the Civil War. So we have basically the whole story of the war. We have a specific case study with the Battle of Antietam, and then we have the continued efforts of people like Clara Barton continuing that story of Civil War medicine and Civil War care thereafter. And so with that, I want to thank you guys for being such a great audience today, and I'm ready to receive your guys' questions.
Okay, class, I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute your microphone one at a time and ask our guest speaker the questions. While I'm waiting, Jacob, I do have a question. You mentioned about the cones that they put the anesthesia in.
Yes.
Do any of those kinds of tools still exist to this day?
So that's a great question. So there was perpetuated for a little while, and I want to see if I can sort of backtrack here. Let's see. Here we go. So in this image right here, you can see the cone that's being put over the patient's face. So that cone is actually just basically a rag that is folded in such a way that it acts as a cone, and then they put that sponge up inside. And there are a couple different types of ether cones or anesthesia cones that are used during the war. In terms of some originals, there is really only one example of an original that is made from a different material other than just this cloth, because these cloth cones, in most cases, just because they're just oftentimes just a cotton cloth rag that's rolled up into a cone, would probably be discarded. But there is an example of a metal cone, which probably wasn't widely used, because you have to think too that with a metal cone, it can be awkwardly shaped. Trying to pack that away in your medical supplies, especially if you're a surgeon who's constantly moving from one battlefield to the next. The thing that works the easiest is just with these cloth cones, is you can fold them up, you can put them away. And really there's only one example of that metal cone, and it kind of looks like a funnel almost. There's also a surgeon during the war. He's a Confederate surgeon named Julian Chisholm. And Julian Chisholm during the war actually starts to develop and then patents an inhaler, which almost looks like a little box that's about this size. You would hold it in your hand. And then that inhaler would have two tubes coming up out of it. So it's a box that would have a sponge soaked in ether or chloroform with 2 tubes that would go up the patient's nose. So that way the patient could inhale through the inhaler. And there are examples of those that still do exist to this day. But for the most part, that cloth ether cone is what's going to be most typical. And oftentimes with those, yeah, they would probably just be discarded, afterwards, just kind of used potentially as just rags, essentially.
Now, you mentioned about the high amount of amputations.
Yes.
Can I go on the assumption that after they became amputees that they were discharged, or did they sometimes return back?
So that's a great question as well. So oftentimes you would have amputees that would sometimes serve in a role there afterwards, after the, put basically in a role as almost like an invalid corps is sort of the best way to think about it. So these are patients that have been injured, but let's say they can still stand on their 2 feet. Maybe they got their arm amputated. Well, what you sometimes see is that these corps of people would sometimes act, in a clerical role, would sometimes act and maybe a guard role, just simply keeping watch, like in Washington, D.C., for instance, going on like different patrols and things like that. But a lot of people, especially depending on the severity of their wounds, oftentimes would just be discharged after an amputation and after a recovery in a hospital. At that point, when they go home, recovery obviously continues, whether that is both, whether that's physical or mental. Something to help, obviously, with recovery was the use of prosthetic limbs. And you see after the Civil War an uptick in the development of prosthetics, prosthetics that look much more lifelike, prosthetics that are more than just a hook with a crude wood. You now have prosthetics that are being made that look like arms, that when they're inside of a sleeve of a jacket or a coat, it looks natural. And then they also too are being, they'll have hinges that are put into them as well. So that way the arm can move in and out. The arm can be fixed in a position. And then the hand too can be fixed in a position as well to potentially hold a tool. So you have this uptick in prosthetics after the war for recovered patients. And most soldiers that had an amputation, especially if they were Union, would typically have access to a prosthetic limb. And the type of prosthetic limb that is most popularly used, especially for arms, is called the Lincoln arm. And that's not in reference to Abraham Lincoln, that's in reference to another gentleman who develops the arm. But the Lincoln arm actually ends up serving as the primary prosthetic arm given to amputees, even going through World War I. It's still being used. So yeah, you do see where people are able to, recover in civilian life through the use of prosthetics.
Wonderful. So class, do you have any questions for our guest speaker?
Yes. How much assistance did they get after the war ended? Those who had been injured?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So obviously it does depend on which side you were fighting for. As the Confederate government no longer exists, if you were a Confederate veteran, you did not get a pension from the federal government. Oftentimes, states would then be required. If you fought for a Confederate state, oftentimes your state would provide you with some sort of pension. And actually, in the Georgia state budget, one of the highest line item in the Georgia state budget at that time is pensions for Georgia veterans. So the states tried to do what they, obviously it depends on which state, what the economic, what the economics are like in that state, depending on like the type of care that you might receive, in the type of pension, type of, compensation that you would get after the war. Now, however, for Union troops, it is federal aid that's being given to Union troops. And usually depending on the severity of their wounds, depending on the severity of the things that they went through, the pensions would be adjusted as so. Obviously, if you're someone who prior to fighting in the Civil War, you were a farmer, you were on your legs a lot, and you lost a leg during the war, well, you're going to receive obviously a higher pension to make up for the fact that you can't necessarily, hold down that same job, that same quality of life that you had prior to the war. So that would be the type of care that would be offered, federally and locally on the state level to Confederate veterans. The other thing to keep in mind too is the type of care that would be given in terms of mental support. Excuse me. And the type of support then mentally, obviously this is a time where people don't understand post-traumatic stress. So there is not as much emphasis put on trying to care for someone mentally after the war. But what you do see is a rise in attendance and memberships for veterans organizations after the war. One of the biggest organizations, obviously, is the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. which is a veterans organization that boasts hundreds of thousands of memberships after the war. The GAR would then start meeting on almost a yearly basis across cities, sometimes they would go to battlefields and host meetings at battlefields to reminisce and things like that. One of the largest is in Boston, I believe in the 1880s, and it has an attendance of over 500,000 Union veterans that come together to basically, essentially, because you can still in the Library of Congress, you can still find the pamphlets that were given out during that, and it really looks like there's some seminars where there are people sort of talking about experiences. There are seminars set up where it helps people to make sure they're getting the aid that they need from serving in the military. And then there's also sightseeing. The one that they have in Boston, they go to Bunker Hill, obviously to see the site of the start of the American Revolution. They go to Plymouth Rock so there's a little bit of sightseeing, a little bit of camaraderie, a little bit of working together. But that's the type of care, the type of aid that would be given to soldiers prior to the conflict, prior to the war.
Great question. Anybody else?
I have another one.
Go ahead.
I've seen references to bleeding and
Yes.
Leeches, use of
Yes.
leeches. Was that pretty common then?
So that is on its way out. So whenever we talk about bleeding falls under that idea of balancing the humors. And that is whenever we refer to that in terms of medicine, we talk about that as heroic medicine. And the reason we call it heroic medicine is because it dates back to the age of heroes. So when we talk about the age of heroes, we're talking about ancient Greece, ancient Rome. And one of the reasons that bleeding would be done is it was believed that there were 4 humors in the human body. And those humors were associated with colors. They were also associated with fluids that are in the human body. So the colors would be red for blood, yellow for urine, white for pus, and then black for bile. And it was said that to be healthy, you needed to have an equal balance of all of those. So if someone is in good humor, someone's laughing, someone's carrying on, someone seems healthy, if you're in good humor. So therefore your humors are all balanced. But let's say that you have a headache or that you are coming down with an illness and you have a fever. And because of that, you're kind of flush in the face. You might, at that point, you might be referred to as being sanguineous. So if you're someone who is sanguineous, well, one way that we can help curb you being sanguineous is through bloodletting, through bleeding. And one of the main ways of doing that was through, procedures like cupping, which is where you cut a wound into the, basically cut a wound into the back, into someone's back, put a cup over top of it. This is still something that's occasionally still practiced holistically today, but cupped onto the back, it's then has a flame put under it, so it vacuum seals and it sucks the blood out of that wound that's on your back, using leeches to drain blood out of your body, or in most cases, just lancing someone, where they would take the forearm. Let me get my forearm in shot here. Around here on the forearm, they would take basically a lancet and cut into the forearm, putting a cup underneath of it, and they would drain blood into that cup. And again, the idea was that you're trying to balance the blood in your body. And again, people are starting to realize just prior to the American Civil War that maybe these practices aren't the best. And for that reason, heroic medicine, that balancing of the humors, is not necessarily practiced in recovery during the American Civil War. I think one of the most notable people that probably unfortunately succumbs to bloodletting is, obviously much prior to the Civil War, but is George Washington. George Washington comes down with an infection of the throat and the lungs, starts to develop some pneumonia, and his doctor prescribes bloodletting. And of course, one of the worst things that you can do when your body is trying to fight an infection with white blood cells that use your blood to get around your body to heal you is to then drain your body of that blood. So people are starting to realizing that blood loss is not usually one of the best practices. And that's why you see prior to the American Civil War, during the American Civil War, and then thereafter, for the few decades after, this rise in patent medicines. Basically, people trying to throw whatever they can, trying to think about it more scientifically, as opposed to, like heroically, using the scientific method to try and test different ways of treatment. And so you'll see this going away from scientific medicines, heroic medicines, but in that you have people obviously being prescribed things like mercury, which can cause mercury poisoning, which can cause death as well. So bloodletting is sort of on the way out at the time of the American Civil War.
It's funny that you mentioned the patented medicine, because my husband's great-great-grandfather was a hernia surgeon, although I never saw that he ever did surgery, but he patented various hernia trusses and different mechanisms.
Right.
Yeah. And also some kind of a liquid formula that he would give people.
Right. Yes. A snake oil salesman.
That's sort of that's the impression I get.
And that was pretty typical, unfortunately, for the patients that had those medicines given to them. It was giving medicine that is often mercury based, mixed with sawdust and things like that, and being, oh, it's a miracle cure. That was unfortunately at the time a pretty common practice. Again, like I said, 80% of people actually had medical degrees, but that other 20%, they were an interesting 20% going about the countryside and selling their tonics and medicines and all sorts of things like that. Okay. I see that we've got some hands up.
I have a question. I don't have my hand up though. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
So I understand you're in Virginia, is that right?
I'm in Frederick, Maryland. So
Excuse me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Frederick, Maryland. Do you have any knowledge of the Confederate hospitals that were in Richmond? Particularly what I'm looking for, an ancestor of my husband's was in Hospital number 4, which was for officers in Richmond, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
He entered with a wound to his right leg. So they put it under the line of disease, wound, right leg. And then they dismissed him, furloughed him 2 days later. Mm-hmm. Were there certain Confederate hospitals that did the amputations? Because when I look up this hospital, it says number 4, mm-hmm. report of wounds of large joints. So that's what that hospital was used for, wounds mm-hmm. of the large joints. But I would think if it was amputated, they would have put amputee or amputated, right?
Yeah. So oftentimes, it should also be noted that around the same time that Jonathan Letterman is developing the Letterman system of evacuation, the Confederates as well start to develop their own system of evacuation, and it runs pretty parallel with the U.S. system of evacuation. And what you see is, again, that breaking up of different types of patients with different types of injuries into different wards where people can more sort of especially care for them with a certain knowledge. And oftentimes what you'll see is in most cases, surgery is going to be performed at a field hospital. So close to the battlefield, because again, you want to operate on these patients as quickly as possible. So that way things like disease and things like that don't start to set into the wounds. So oftentimes, excuse me, oftentimes capital amputation and capital, big surgeries are oftentimes being performed on the battlefield or just off the battlefield. And then they're taken into places like Richmond for recovery. What you will see though, in terms of surgeries, and this might be why it says, almost like a surgery of a joint, is resections. So oftentimes if, let's say, so for instance, you said that it was also labeled under disease.
So on this Confederate, it's a sheet with his name and the date that he got injured. And the very top, it says Richmond, Virginia, hospital number 4, and then it's printed disease, and then they write in, it looks like the writing, VS, right leg. So maybe a vein, I don't know.
Yeah, it could be, because especially because it's listed under disease. It could simply be that he had an amputation, probably at a field hospital, was brought there for recovery. Infection started to set in, and then therefore they had to perform another surgery at the hospital, a resection, to then cut further back on the limb to now cut off the newly infected part. So it could be something along those lines. One of the things with Confederate medicine is, unfortunately, there's a lot of gaps. And one of the reasons for that is whenever Richmond is burned to the ground in 1865, one of the things that is burned along with Richmond, and that's basically because people in the archives at Richmond at the time, the military archives, they want to burn the military archives. So it is the Confederates themselves that burn the archives. That fire then spreads and it burns all of the medical archives as well. So where we have a lot of knowledge about specific things that deal with Union medicine, unfortunately, when it comes to Confederate medicine, there are a lot of gaps because of the burning of the archives in Richmond.
Understood. I was surprised to find some records through NARA for him. In the sense that, I think they're from NARA, in the sense that he ended up leaving August 1864. So maybe some records were moved or something before the end of the war.
Yeah, and it's also possible too that because he was an officer, being at that higher level of status in society meant that, their records may be more widely available, widely kept than just a random infantryman who suffered from maybe a similar surgery or something like that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. You gave me some insight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great topic.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also want to see, we have the chat. And we do have a lot of questions in the chat.
I see Randall and George have their hands up. Randall, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I just had a question. I'm with the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. Would you be interested in maybe doing this presentation over a Zoom to them? And if so, how could I get a hold of you?
Yeah, so the way that you can go about that is you can contact our reservation specialist. Let me pull up his email really quickly. So that way you can go ahead and contact him that way. So give me just one moment.
All right, thank you.
And while you're doing that, let's see here. George, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, this is kind of a genealogy question. I apologize because I came to the meeting late today because ironically, I was under general anesthesia. How appropriate. I was having a kidney stone removal treatment
Oh my goodness.
at a surgical center. So I
Sure.
arrived a little late. So in case you touched on this already, I apologize. But I was just curious, and I have to ask this because this is a genealogy group. My grandmother was a Davis, and my great-grandfather was named Thomas Jefferson Davis. He was a Confederate soldier during the Civil War. And I was just wondering if you had touched on maybe any of your personal connections to the Civil War, or where were your Davises from, or have you done any genealogies? I know Davis is a common name, but I was just kind of curious and had to ask.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, just before we started today, we were talking a little bit about family genealogy. For me, all of my Davises, they basically the earliest that I've been able to find is one of my ancestors, Ebenezer Davis Jr., who lives on a tract of land in Western Maryland,
Okay.
around Cumberland, Maryland, and closer to the Monongahela River at the time it was Virginia. Today it's West Virginia, close to Lake Morgantown, if you're familiar with WVU. And my Davises basically have lived there really ever since. And as for myself, I grew up in Cumberland and
Oh, okay.
only moved an hour away from home. So
Deep roots
so,
in Maryland then, okay.
yeah,
And
yeah.
like I said, Davis is pretty common. My particular line, as far as I know, originated in North Carolina. And then they took that kind of Western migration route through Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and then ultimately into Texas, where my great-grandfather was born in 1840. And he served from a Confederate Union in unit in Texas. But I've just recently been doing a lot of research on Davises and trying to sort them all out. So I was just curious. So did you actually have a Civil War ancestor with the name Davis? And did he serve with the Confederacy or the Union?
So I actually, as far as I've been able to tell, it's like with the way that the generations worked in the Davis family, it's like they missed, it seemed like almost every
wrong age.
major conflict. Ironically though, my great grandfather is George Washington Davis. My great grandfather is Benjamin Franklin Davis. So,
oh my gosh, and I've got Thomas Jefferson Davis.
Right, exactly. So I guess it's
funny,
yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, any other questions?
Hi, it's Wendy. Hey, so we've been working on my James Henry Murphy, who was in the Civil War. And when I look at his when he left the war and, the JR and all the reports, they say that he has a disease of the feet. So I'm curious about that, but I'm also curious, how did these soldiers not have foot rot? And they probably had foot rot, and because they did so much walking, and he went with Sherman's March to the Sea, so he went all the way from Illinois down to the sea, and then I guess he wasn't discharged until up in Washington DC.
Yeah,
that's my question. Thank you.
So what you often see, so like a disease of the feet, that could mean just about anything. Oftentimes they'll just put catch-all terms on it. So that could mean that, they had foot rot. That could mean that they started to feel, that could mean that they had gout even, and they're suffering on their feet. But yeah, it's important to keep in mind that these soldiers oftentimes are carrying upwards of 60 pounds on them at any time, between their gun, all of their clothing, all of their equipment, and potential other camping equipment that they might be carrying along with them as well. And the other thing to note is that, the main way of getting around at this time obviously is on your feet. And for a lot of these people who may have not traveled maybe more than 10 miles from their home throughout most of their life, now traveling hundreds of miles, to distant battlefields, you do see a lot of injuries and a lot of chronic injuries even that continue after the Civil War, that deal with joint issues, back issues, feet, ankle, legs, you name it. And oftentimes too, these would be put under a catch-all as well of rheumatism, like rheumatoid arthritis. And you'll see rheumatism a lot on reasons why soldiers are being discharged, or reasons why on certain pension applications you might have rheumatism listed on their pension applications. So diseases of the joints and the feet are you see those all the time. There's a really good source. It's called the Medical and Surgical Histories of the Late War of the Rebellion. This is a conglomerated book that comes out, I want to say in the 1870s, 1880s. You can find copies of it online for free, but it will list case studies of a lot of soldiers, not every soldier, but case studies of so many soldiers where essentially surgeons are sharing their cases with names, regiments, what they're suffering from, all those sorts of things. And what some of these soldiers are suffering from runs a whole gambit of issues, from things as small as a loss of a big toenail all the way up to, you know, being shot in the trunk of the body and things like that. So that's a really great resource. I know some people that have also been able to find details about their ancestors because they were published in that book. And again, that's the medical and surgical histories of the late war of the rebellion.
Okay, I see another question. Hicks iPad, you have your hand up. Please ask your question.
In today's operative field, patients are kept NPO, nothing by mouth, in order to reduce the risk of aspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume that really wasn't done during the Civil War days, particularly if they were given a shot of whiskey to kind of bolster them for whatever reason for the surgery.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any discussion about the incidence of postoperative aspiration or intraoperative aspiration during the Civil War? And I've always wondered if that might explain Stonewall Jackson's postoperative pneumonitis, which eventually led to his death. Thank you.
Yeah. So today, obviously, there's a lot of post-op and most of the medicine and things that are being given to patients today, especially if they're still under the influence of anesthetics or coming to, obviously, are going to be intravenously, not given through the mouth. Excuse me. There's also no real, today we also have, like, you know, in terms of like first aid, CPR, we have the recovery position, which puts the person specifically on their side in a way that if they do aspirate, you know, any fluids or anything like that can come out of their mouth. So therefore they don't choke and die. So basically the way recovery is at this time in the Civil War is typically patients are going to be taken off of the operating table. And let me go back to the presentation here. I think we had an image that might be relatable. Let me look for it. So this image here, if you look, you can see this is actually an image from the Battle of Antietam. It was a sketch that was done at the Battle of Antietam. You can see patients laying off to the side, and basically that's what patient recovery looks like. They lay the patients right on their back. You can see that they're kind of propped up, so that might be in an effort to reduce aspiration. But yeah, I mean, right there is patient recovery post-surgery in this image right here.
Okay, it looks like there's still a few hands up. Hicks iPad, you still have your hand up?
Yeah, then the other question was possibly did Stonewall Jackson aspirate under his anesthetic after his arm amputation, which led to a pneumonitis afterwards?
I mean,
Any
that's
evidence for that?
That's certainly possible. Obviously, he's one of those people that is really well written about. But I think that also might be something that, yeah, isn't even necessarily on the radar of those surgeons whenever they're, you know, in terms of post-op care for a patient. It's certainly possible that's what could have led to Jackson's illness and subsequent, you know, death. But yeah, and unfortunately, there's not really a whole lot that's specifically written about sort of his care there afterwards. They talk about, you know, like his lapse in health and things like that, but not necessarily trying to put a specific name to it. You know, in most cases, most people kind of the way they talk about it is he dies as a result of you know, his state at the time, his loss of his continence and things like that, you know, after his surgery and being in hospital. There
you.
are.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, and thank you for a great talk as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, in the chat box, it looks like Lori has a question. Lori, would you like to unmute your microphone?
It's more a comment than a question,
Okay.
kind of. Okay, my brother insists that my great uncle died in my great grandmother's arms on her front porch. She lived
Yes.
in St. Louis and he died in Little Rock.
Okay.
So my brother was rather upset when I told him that. Do any of you, how do you resolve issues with family members when you dispel family legend? I know
So-
it's probably not right on subject, but I keep seeing it, you know, this keeps coming up.
Sure. I will say that as a history professional, someone who's been working in various museums, especially museums that pertain to military history, that I've definitely had my fair share of people telling me that either I'm wrong, like me personally, that I'm wrong in my interpretation, or because I know that my great grandfather was a Hessian and things like that. And it's one of those things that you just have to approach and say, I am giving you this information based off of the primary sources that I have found. And like we talked about a little bit at the top, you do have where, I guess, what was the actual statistic? It was after 3 generations. That's when tall tales about family members. Like, for instance, I was told growing up that we were related to Mary Todd Lincoln because my great grandmother used to at all the family gatherings would talk about how we're related to Mary Todd Lincoln. And yeah, that was not true after doing some research and following primary sources. And so at that point, you can just say, this is what the sources say. This is where the primary sources have led me. And that's the best thing other than from the person's mouth. And obviously we don't have that anymore, or even their own personal writings. So
I showed him his medical records from the military. He died in the Civil War.
And
he dropped he was drinking a glass of milk, dropped his gun and shot himself in the stomach.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And that probably has to do obviously with the fact that, and that's something that unfortunately you do see a lot during the Civil War because there's no understanding of post-traumatic stress. And the American Civil War, we like to sort of view it from this lens, especially when you talk about like modern Hollywood interpretations. And by modern, I mean like last 30 years. So like things like Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. In those movies, it looks like a very noble war. It's very bloodless because, it's a PG-13 Hollywood movie. Yeah. People are witnessing things on these battlefields that have never been witnessed prior to this. When you take a young farm boy from the backwoods of Pennsylvania, and now they are witnessing one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, you can imagine the effect that that's going to have on people mentally. And it can also be difficult to reckon with the fact that maybe my ancestor committed suicide. That's something today that we don't necessarily, that still is very difficult to sort of talk about is when people do take their own lives. And so again, it's one of those things where all you can say is, this is the primary source that I have. And not only that, it's pretty typical that if a family member dies in a traumatic way, especially taking their own life, especially in 1860s America, which is a very conservative, very puritanical society, that you might not want to share that that's how they died, and therefore you might make up a story to say, oh no, my ancestor, or my brother, my family member died in my arms, because you don't want people to know, because at that time they might view it as shameful.
It appeared as though it was an accident when he dropped his gun. It just
dropped his gun. Well, then that's still. I mean, so sorry, I went on a whole tangent about suicide and mental health.
That's okay. Yeah.
But even then, that's if you think like you have all these people that are dying on a battlefield because they died in battle, they died fighting, and then he died because he drank a glass of milk and dropped his gun and it went off and he shot himself in the chest. That again, that's a whole thing where a family member could see some form of shame in that. You have all these other people coming back with war stories and how'd your ancestor die? How'd your ancestor die? Oh, well, mine died because he was drinking a glass of milk and accidentally had an accidental discharge of his firearm. So yeah, you can imagine.
Yeah, okay,
yeah,
that
yeah.
makes sense.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I see Catherine still got her hand up.
Yes, I was really glad that you brought up about the series of books, The Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. I wanted to let people know that they can find on the National Institutes of Health
Yeah.
website. And I was able to find my husband's great uncle. He lost his arm. Well, he was shot at the Battle of Ezra Church. I think that's north of Atlanta, and his left arm was amputated, and he doesn't get one of the longer case histories in the book, but he's in the index, and then on the page where the index says it tells his name and his regiment and when it happened, and that it was a left arm and it was done by a flap, whatever that means. And it tells by the surgeon, AC messenger of the 57th Ohio. And he returned to duty, and which answers your question, one of the questions about what happened to him afterwards, that he returned to duty on October 15th, 1864, and that it had been amputated at the end of July. So that's not very long to me.
No, yeah, I mean, it seems like a pretty short turnaround for recovery, but I mean, the human body is an incredible thing, and you know, he wouldn't have been discharged from hospital unless he was back at some semblance of full health.
He was a major, so maybe he had some lighter duties than being in the front lines.
And that's, you do see, yeah, and that of course tells a lot as well. You do see a lot of officers who will lose a limb. I think Stonewall Jackson's probably a good example of this, but officers that will lose a limb and then continue to serve because, you know, they're not necessarily needing to be out on the battlefield using two arms to shoot if they're a major and they're just using their sword to sort of point around. I think another there's a lot of examples throughout history of people who have been maimed, especially officers, and continue to serve in that capacity, in that role. Or sometimes if you're an officer as well, that obviously means that you're a literate, learned person in most cases. So that could be that he took on a clerical duty thereafter or something along those lines.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, any other questions? I see all the hands are down on the list of people attending today.
Oh, and I do want to put in the chat, it is the contact information for the museum here to contact the museum if you wanted to see a future program.
And Jacob, I will be reaching out to you, and I'll let it go a couple months, you know, just for variety sake, but I will love to invite you back again.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would love to talk to another one of your classes or same class again. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, if there's no other questions, then Jacob, I'd like to say thank you very, very much for a wonderful and very engaging presentations. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to invite everyone to stay for the second half of class before I stop the recording. And if you're going to leave us right now at this point in time, if there's anything in the chat box you want, make sure to please download that chat box before you sign off. Once again, I'd like to invite everyone to stay for the second half of class. And Jacob, thank you so much once again for your time and your expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for hosting me. And if anyone is ever in the DC metro area, please come visit us here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland.